Hello students, in the last video I have said you about the different types of ratio. Today in this part I am going to discuss about liquidity ratio, also known as short-term solvency ratios. So what are liquidity ratios? Liquidity means the ability of the enterprise to meet its short-term financial obligation as they become due. Or we can say that it is the ability of the enterprise to meet its current liabilities. So there are two types of ratios which comes under liquidity ratio. One is current ratio, the second one is quick ratio or liquid ratio, also known as acid test ratio. Now what is current ratio? So current ratio is a relationship of current assets to current liabilities. It shows the ability of the enterprise to meet its short-term financial obligations. So the formula of current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. Now let's see what comes under current assets, the components and items which are included in current assets. The first one is current investments, also known as short-term investments, plus inventories. Now from inventories we'll exclude loose tools and stores and spares. Why? Because this loose tools, stores and spares are held by the enterprise as production tool and not for the purpose of converting them into cash and cash equivalents. So generally we are not getting the final product for sale. That is why uh, rather it is being used for production purpose. So that is why we are not including this loose tools, stores and spares in the inventories. Next comes trade receivables. Now what are trade receivables? Bills receivable and sundry debtors are included in trade receivables. But another thing you have to keep in mind that the sundry debtors which we are writing over here should not include the provision for doubtful debt. That is why we have subtracted the provision for doubtful debts over here. Now the reason is because this amount, the provision for doubtful debt, is a amount which is doubtful of recovery. And generally in the current ratio we are determining the company's ability at that moment to meet its short-term financial obligation. So the thing which is doubtful whether we'll receive it or not, or it might happen that we might receive this in future. So that is why we are excluding the provision for doubtful debts. Next is cash and bank balances plus short-term loans and advances which the firm has provided to someone, plus other current assets. The other current assets include like prepaid expenses, marketable securities, etc. Now there is another this formula for finding out the current assets. That is, from the total assets, if we deduct the non-current assets. Now what are the non-current assets? The fixed assets. If we deduct fixed assets or non-current assets from the total assets, we will get current assets. Now if you remember another formula, that is the working capital. The working capital is equal to current assets minus current liability. Now if we take that formula also, from that formula we can derive current assets, which is equal to current liabilities plus working capital. Now moving on to current liabilities, which includes short-term borrowings. Now the borrowings which or the loan which are taken for less than a year, plus trade payables which includes creditors and bills payable, plus other current liabilities. Now other current liabilities include outstanding services, that payment for outstanding services, advances taken from any customer and services has not been provided yet, and many more. Plus short-term provisions. Now short-term provisions include provision for doubtful debts, provision for tax, provision for discount on debtors. Now you might also ask like what are long-term provisions? So some examples for long-term provisions are provision for depreciation, provision for repairs and renewals. This will not be included. So another formula for current liabilities which we can use is current liabilities equal to current assets minus working capital. That is, from we are deriving this formula from the working capital formula only, which is working capital equals to current assets minus current liability. Now, the idle current ratio. The idle current ratio is generally 2 is to 1. That is, if the current ratio is 2, only then the realization from current assets are considered to be adequate to meet the current liabilities in time and enable the enterprise to meet other day-to-day expenses. Generally, a low current ratio means that the enterprise is unable to meet its current liabilities on time, and it also has inadequate working capital. On the other hand, a high current ratio means that the funds are not used efficiently and are generally lying idle. So, both the cases, very high current ratio, very low current ratio, is not good for the firm. Okay, next moving on to quick ratio or liquid ratio, also known as acid test ratio, which means it's a relationship of quick assets or liquid assets with current liability. It is computed to assess the short term liquidity of the enterprise. That means how quickly the fund can generate cash and cash equivalents. Next, the formula for quick ratio is quick assets or liquid assets divided by current liabilities. The ideal liquid ratio is 1 is to 1. Now, liquid assets. How to find liquid assets? It's very simple. If from the current assets, the formula which we have used earlier, all the components which come in current assets, but from the current assets, we have to deduct inventories and prepaid expenses. Now, why to deduct inventories? Because we are giving emphasis on the ready availability of cash in case of liquid ratio. But the inventories will take some time to be converted into cash and bank balance. And it is also uncertain as to how much time it will need to realize cash or cash equivalent. Okay, so that is why we are excluding inventories from the current assets. And prepaid expenses is excluded because they are the expenses paid in advance and they do not get converted into cash. So it is preferred that the higher the quick ratio, it's better is the short term financial position of the firm. And this ratio is important basically for banks and financial institution. One more thing you have to keep in mind, that the quick ratio and current ratio both are calculated on a particular date and not for a particular period. Because if you have seen the formula, this includes the items from balance sheet. And balance sheet, as we all know, is prepared on a particular date and not for a particular period. So that is why the quick ratio and current ratio are calculated on a particular date. That's all for today's class. Thank you.